Today, I want to talk about Copilot, which is another one of these AI code suggestion tools, which, as of late, are actually gaining a lot more traction as neural networks are finally getting to the point where you can actually get reasonable insights out of them. Now, this one is actually a little bit different because GitHub is the company behind it, and GitHub has access to billions of lines of code, and that is the data that was used to actually train the network. And the results you get from it, at least from the examples that I have seen, have actually been surprisingly good. Like, assuming these results are actually real and not just made up, this is very good. And from the tests that I've seen from people on Twitter, all the results I've seen, except for the ones that are intentionally trolling it, which I'll get into in just a bit, actually are really good results. So we are still in the fairly early stages of code synthesization. Obviously, it's not intended to write entire projects for you. It's not going to replace like an entire dev team. It's not going to write an entire kernel, but it actually can solve fairly complex problems if those problems have been seen in other places before or are similar enough to problems in the dataset. And the About page makes this very clear. While it can do more complex stuff, what it's really good at is dealing with the boilerplate code, or the code that doesn't really require that much thinking. Things like, I want a function that will send a tweet. I want a function that'll parse this JSON and put it into variables that match the data types. I want a function that will send an email. I want a function that will, for example, do some tests on my code. That's one of the examples they have down here. I want to autofill some repetitive code. Things like this that you can obviously do by hand very easily, but you don't really need to. And especially in cases of things like repetitive code or test suites, having a lot of that stuff being auto-written for you actually will save a lot of time. Especially in cases of tests where you may miss out on some of the edge cases because you just weren't really thinking about the problem in that way. While I do think Copilot is a really, really cool piece of technology, this would not be my channel if we didn't talk about the concerns. So Copilot is a code synthesizer. This basically means that it will take information that's been trained on and then output some new bit of code. It's not a code search engine, but neural networks also are not magic. The only results they can produce are results based on their input. So what if some of their input is, say, GPL'd code, which it was because it was trained on GitHub and they didn't filter that code out? We can see what might happen when we have this result right here. So I know it's going to be kind of hard to see. I'll zoom in on it a bit. You may recognize this block of code. This is the fast inverse square root. And you might also recognize the comments, because this is a block of code taken from the Quake source code. Now, normally Copilot isn't going to just regurgitate some result like this. The reason why this may have done so is this is a very, very common block of code. So there's probably a bunch of projects out there, probably thousands of projects in fact, that have used this exact block of code with the comments included. And when you try to get a fast inverse square root, it's going to go with what it seems like is the best result. And if there's thousands of projects using this exact block of code, well, it makes sense why it would regurgitate the result as the best result. However, there are two problems here. And the first problem is this block of code is a GPL block of code. So if you plan to use this in a project that you want to take proprietary, well, now you've just violated the GPL. The second problem is what this decides to write out as the license for the code. And if you know anything about GPL, you probably realize that what you're reading right now is not a GPL license. And that's a problem. Because of the comments you see, I have seen one or two people say this is fake, because Copilot is supposed to go and filter out offensive words. But from the testing that other people have done, it seems like it only filters based on your input. So if you want to go and say, generate something, I don't know, with the starting word being genocide, it just won't run. But if you have some output that contains that word, it doesn't seem to have any issue with that. I have another example which isn't a license violation, but it does demonstrate the problems with code synthesization. So someone decided to generate an About Me page, and it included links to Salesforce's website and also links to someone's GitHub and their Twitter. Now, this specific About Me page does not actually exist. There is no David Sellis who lives in the Bay Area and works at Salesforce. But what this does demonstrate is that the neural net isn't just coming up with completely new stuff. If there are Twitter links there, it might just dump out the Twitter links. If there are links to company websites, it might just dump them out. And that makes me kind of worried about the sort of information it can dump out. I hope they're not including things like API keys and occasionally dumping those out. According to GitHub, 0.1% of results are verbatim snippets. Now, I have no way to confirm or deny this, and while that doesn't sound like a lot, if that includes GPL code, it can be a pretty big concern. Moving away from the whole legal issue for a bit, there is another problem, and that is with code maintenance, because while Copilot can absolutely produce really good results, and it can save a lot of time on the creation side of the code, at some point, the developer does need to maintain that code and make sure that what Copilot actually outputted actually makes sense. And without a good understanding of how that code actually functions, doing so becomes very difficult. For example, let's say it outputted that inverse square root function and outputted it wrong. If you don't know what that function is supposed to look like, good luck trying to fix that. I'm not saying that code synthesization is a bad thing, but if you don't understand the block of code that it is outputting, it would basically be exactly the same as taking a block of code from Stack Overflow and just dumping it into your code base. You need to understand the code that is in your code base. For a lot of parts of your code base, that might not be that big of a deal, but let's say it's something a bit more security relevant. Let's say you use Copilot to generate some user input code, or let's say for some sort of network connection or a database connection and some SQL statements, and it builds code that has a vulnerability inside of it because there's a lot of devs out there who've built that vulnerability into their code as well. I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of devs out there, especially new devs who might not be that experienced, who will just accept the output that Copilot suggests, and because Copilot has suggested it, not really go back and examine it. For example, one of the blocks I skipped on the About page actually has a bug in it. Now, if you're a new developer, you might not notice this bug straight away, but this value right here is supposed to be a currency value, and the number is being stored in a float. Now, that might make a lot of sense because it's a floating point value. Obviously, it should be stored in a float. You do not want to store currency in a floating point value. Floating point values will always have some form of precision error. The correct way to do it is to store both sides of the decimal point in two separate integers to make sure that's not going to be a problem. But because there are a lot of developers who do this wrong, obviously it's going to produce an output that is also wrong. Another concern I've seen floating around is about the rights of the copyright holders. What I mean by this is there's a lot of developers out there who've been getting really annoyed with the fact that GitHub has just taken their code to go and train their machine learning model with it. And what I have to say to this ultimately is it's your fault for using GitHub. GitHub is a massive corporate entity and they have a terms of service. And if we actually have a look at that terms of service, there's an interesting line in here. Under the license grant to us section, us referring to GitHub, it says we need the legal right to do things like host your content, publish it, and share it. You grant us now legal successors the right to store, archive, parse, and display your content and make incidental copies as necessary to provide the service, including improving the service over time. The part that you should be paying attention to here is including improving the service over time and the right to parse. Now, I am not a lawyer, but I feel like there's going to be a legal team that makes a lot of money trying to answer whether GitHub actually has the right to do this based on this statement. I don't actually know, but I feel like that is sort of how they're trying to justify it. So if you were to upload a repo to GitHub that states, my code cannot be used as training data, you would potentially be violating the TOS, while they would also be violating your license. I don't know who would be in the wrong there. My suggestion is the easy one. If you have a problem with this, get your code off of GitHub. If you didn't already get your code off of GitHub when Microsoft acquired it, maybe this is going to be the reason you go and do so. Personally, if I'm uploading to someone else's servers, I sort of expect they're going to be doing sketchy stuff to it anyway. But because the code is public, personally, I don't care. But if you do, put your code somewhere like GitLab, maybe even go and self-host it so that it's not a problem in the future. I know I'm being pretty critical of Copilot, but I do think this is a really, really cool piece of technology. It's just a legal nightmare to work with, and if you're in a commercial context, minus the boilerplate code, I would not touch this. If your legal department is not looking into this project, that's a very bad sign, because it should probably not be used in a commercial context as it currently stands. Until the courts have answered very important questions about code synthesization and licensing, it is basically a ticking time bomb waiting to blow. But in 20 or so years, I feel like a lot of the lower skilled dev jobs probably are going to be automated. I know it probably seems crazy to think that developer jobs are going to be automated, but I find it hard to believe that they're not going to be. And if they're not fully automated, there is going to be a heavy integration with tools like this. Before I go, I just want to say, go follow Copilot Tweets. This is a Twitter account which tweets the absolute nonsense you can get Copilot to spit out if you start to mess with it. For example, a pasta recipe is 1 cup of pasta, 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 and 1 cup of pasta. But there's plenty more like this. For example, I am a pity to be a pain in the ass. I am a super duper 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 so on and so forth dude. Show me the money. I don't care about you. I don't care about you. Neural nets are kind of fun sometimes. For now though, that'll be everything for me. So before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim Donald, Logan Michael, Andrew Mitchell Nathan, David Carl Will, Brennan, Chickapento, Jamie Joseph Josh, Michael Pittity, Stephen Tees, through Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to go and support my work, there are links down below to my Patreon, subscribe, star, Pay, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, where I live stream twice a week and upload usually about 5 YouTube shorts, and this channel is available over on Odyssey. Maybe one day I will be an AI too. Maybe I am now. That's it for me, and I'm out.